In March 1967, amidst the escalating conflict in Indochina, Jon, a Marine reservist, found himself facing a difficult decision. Heeding the call to active duty in Vietnam, he discussed his plans with his wife Sandra. Married for 3 years, they had a small house and were contemplating starting a family. Sandra worked as a paralegal, and with their combined incomes, they were financially secure, with a healthy savings account for unforeseen circumstances. Sandra wept, but understood Jon's profound sense of duty. Jon, a strong and muscular man, known for his toughness in a fight, had mellowed considerably since marrying his high school sweetheart. However, he could still hold his own in a brawl if necessary. They said their tearful goodbyes and spent a passionate final night together before his departure. "You'd better come back in one piece," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And don't go chasing after other women. This is mine, only mine," she added playfully, grabbing his crotch. "Don't worry, sweetie," he reassured her. "I'll take good care of myself. And you better behave while I'm gone. I know how those wealthy lawyers can be." "No problem, sweetie," she replied. "I promise to be good." Before leaving, Jon updated his will and arranged automatic payments from his military salary to cover the mortgage and utilities. He also treated himself to a new tattoo: Death Before Dishonor. In Vietnam, Jon served as a fire team leader. Initially met with skepticism by his fellow Marines due to his reservist status, he quickly earned their respect after several combat engagements. Unlike many Marines, he avoided relationships with local women, remaining faithful to Sandra despite the constant teasing from Lance Corporal Harker. Harker warned him about the prevalence of Jody, a slang term for men who pursued military wives whose husbands were deployed, but Jon trusted Sandra implicitly. Jon wrote to Sandra as often as possible and treasured her letters in return. Initially, he received letters every 2 weeks, but after a few months, they became less frequent. He found this odd, especially as he started receiving more letters from his parents, including photos of Sandra in a swimsuit he had never seen before. He couldn't help but wonder who had taken them. That Christmas, he received a card and letter from his parents, but nothing from Sandra. Concerned, but determined to stay focused on his mission, he remained vigilant. In mid-January 1968, stationed near Da Nang, rumors circulated of an impending major offensive by the Viet Cong around the Tet Lunar New Year at the end of the month. The rumors proved true. Chaos erupted as Jon's position came under heavy attack. They fought fiercely, but most of Jon's team, including Harker, perished. Jon was severely injured. He and other surviving Marines were evacuated to Da Nang and then to a military hospital in San Francisco. Doctors managed to save his leg, though he faced a long and arduous recovery. The bullet had missed major organs, and stitches mended his cheek. His ear was bandaged, and the nurses assured him the scar gave him a distinguished air, though he wasn't convinced. Jon's time in Vietnam was over. A Marine officer awarded him a Purple Heart and informed him he was being recommended for a Silver Star. He had already earned a Bronze Star with a Combat V and a Navy Commendation Medal. Jon's parents met him at the hospital in San Francisco. He wondered where Sandra was and if she knew he was back in the States. His father, a veteran himself, chuckled. "Damn, son, I thought I taught you how to duck." His mother hugged him tightly and wept. "Where's Sandra?" Jon asked. His parents exchanged uneasy glances. "I honestly don't know, son," his father finally admitted. "We tried calling the house and her office, but they kept saying she was out, and she never returned our calls. I haven't seen her in weeks. I went by every weekend to take care of the yard and check on things, but nothing." "Tell him, Bob," Jon's mother urged. "Tell me what, Mom?" Jon asked, his anxiety growing. "What's going on?" "Son, the last time I saw Sandra was maybe 2.5 months ago. I was driving down your street and saw a man leaving your house. He got into a sports car, I think it was a Corvette, and sped off. I saw Sandra at the door in her bathrobe, waving goodbye. She didn't say anything when I arrived. I haven't seen her since. I've been picking up the newspapers and collecting your mail when I stopped by. I'm sorry, son." Jon was heartbroken. He had believed in Sandra's loyalty. Then he remembered Harker's warnings about Jody. Perhaps he had been right all along. Now he understood her silence. Was it a blue Corvette? John asked. Bob nodded. Yes, it was, he said. Why, do you know who owns it? Yes, John replied, his voice heavy with resignation. It belongs to Eric Swagman, a junior partner at her law firm. So she isn't even home long enough to collect the mail? Doesn't seem like it, Bob said. I hope you don't mind, but I saw a couple of utility and phone bills marked final notice, so I took care of them. I figured you wouldn't want to come home to a house without power or phone service. Thanks, Dad, John said. I'll pay you back as soon as I get home. I promise. Don't worry about it, son, Bob reassured him. Just focus on getting better. Don't stress about this until you're ready. If you want, I can look into getting power of attorney. If she's not handling the bills, who knows what else she might have neglected. For all we know, she could have already cleaned out your accounts. John asked a nurse for assistance in locating a military lawyer. Soon, a Navy lieutenant commander arrived and took notes as John and his parents explained the situation. He pulled out some documents from his briefcase. I'll get these power of attorney papers prepared for you, Corporal, he said. They will grant your parents the legal authority to handle the matters you've described. I also recommend you consult with a family law attorney in your home state as soon as possible. I'll have the paperwork ready, and we can meet here this afternoon to sign and notarize it. Thank you, sir, John said. After the lawyer left, Bob turned to his, As soon as we get home, son, I'll check with the bank to see what's going on. I still have the house key you gave me, so I'll stop by and make sure everything's all right there. You remember George Williams? Retired from the police force a couple months back? He's working as a private investigator now. I can ask him to look into this for you if you'd like, Bob offered. I'm not sure I can afford a private investigator, Dad, John replied, concerned. Bob shook his head. Don't you worry about that, son. George owes me a few favors. We worked together for 13 years on the force. I'll also talk to our family lawyer. I think he still handles family law cases. Bob continued. By the way, Mr. Wilkins said your job at the shop is still open. He's been saving a quarter of your pay since you left as a welcome back bonus. Said he wasn't about to let the best mechanic in the state slip away. But don't tell him I told you. John was grateful. Wilkins was a generous man, though he rarely showed it. He was fair and honest with his customers, but had a gruff exterior that could be intimidating. That sounds good, Dad, John said, a tear rolling down his cheek. Damn that woman, he thought. His parents embraced him. It'll be all right, son, his mother said. We'll get through this. A few hours later, the attorney returned with a notary. After signing the power of attorney documents, John's parents left, promising to call with any updates. They thanked the nurse, who assured them John was receiving excellent care and that the VA would arrange for the necessary physical therapy. John was finally alone to confront the wreckage of his life. He rested, but his dreams were haunted by images of his fallen comrades, not Sandra. A few days later, John received a call from his father. Bad news, son, Bob began. Sandra has drained nearly all of your checking and savings accounts. About 2 months ago, she withdrew $8,545 from your savings. I have the bank statement. She took it out in cash. The only deposits during those 2 months were from your military pay. According to the bank teller, Sandra came in a few days after each payday and withdrew everything except for $5, just enough to keep the account active. She didn't open a new account, so I have no idea what she did with the money. All right, Dad, John said, his voice resigned. Since you have power of attorney, remove her name from the account. We don't have any joint credit cards, so that's not a concern. Will do, Bob replied. I also went by the house. It's a disaster. Moldy food on the table, dishes piled up in the sink, and it smells awful. Looks like she took all her clothes and personal belongings, but left her wedding dress and album. I found her wedding and engagement rings in the bathroom trash. I'm sorry, son. At least the house is still standing, John said, trying to find a silver lining. Yeah, Bob replied. Your mother's there now, cleaning up and airing the place out. The bed's a mess, though. Sheets are badly stained. If I had to guess, Sandra had company. What do you want to do about it? Get rid of it, John said. Dispose of it and pile it up outside if you have to. I'll manage with a cot. All right, Bob said. I'll handle it. George offered to take your case pro bono. He said nothing's worse than someone who preys on a soldier's wife while he's serving his country. I also found a top-notch lawyer who's agreed to handle your divorce for free. He can't stand Swagman, who apparently has a reputation for pursuing married women. George suggested we change the locks on your house, and I agreed. Are you okay with that? Yeah, that sounds like a good plan, Dad, Jon said. All right, we'll keep in touch. How are you holding up? Bob asked. I'm doing all right, Dad, really, Jon said. Who are you trying to convince, me or yourself? Bob asked gently. Jon smiled. His father always had a keen sense of perception. Dad, you lost men in combat, right? Jon asked. He knew it was a redundant question, considering his father's service as a second lieutenant with the 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller at the Chosin Reservoir in 1950. His father knew all about combat, sacrifice, and death. Yes, son, I have, Bob replied quietly. This might sound strange, Dad, but have you ever had dreams where they spoke to you? Jon asked. Oh, yes. At first it was almost every night. It became less frequent over time, Bob said. Have you ever gotten over it? Jon asked. You never completely get over it, son. It becomes a part of you. You have to make peace with it and learn to live with it, or it will consume you, Bob said wisely. The next 2 weeks passed quickly for Jon. He heard from his parents daily with updates on Sandra, but never from Sandra herself. She had moved in with Eric Swagman and was pregnant with his child. Everyone at her law firm knew about their affair. The divorce proceedings were progressing smoothly. Jon's lawyer, Mike McGregor, was filing for divorce on grounds of adultery and abandonment. He was also suing Eric for alienation of affection and taking legal action against Sandra's employer for failing to uphold their moral standards. Mike mentioned the possibility of additional charges against Swagman based on evidence George had uncovered. Bob mentioned that Sandra had a complete meltdown when she discovered she was no longer listed on Jon's military pay account and couldn't access his money. She also realized her house keys no longer worked. Bob and his wife told her to seek assistance from her boyfriend. Jon focused on his recovery, finding some dark humor in Sandra's predicament. His physical wounds were healing, but he struggled emotionally, grieving for his fallen Marines and hurt by his soon-to-be ex-wife's betrayal. Jon learned to navigate with a crutch and a cane, and the doctors determined it was time to remove his cast. He was also cleared to drive a vehicle with an automatic transmission. Back in his room, Jon noticed as soon as we get home, son, I'll check with the bank to see what's happening. I still have the house key you gave me, so I'll stop by and check on things. He continued, You know George Williams? Retired from the police force a couple of months ago? He's working as a private investigator now. I could ask him to look into this for you if you'd like. I'm not sure I can afford a private investigator, Dad, Jon said. Bob shook his head. Don't worry about that, son. George owes me a few favors. We worked together for 13 years on the force. I'll also talk to our family lawyer. I think he still handles family law cases. Bob added, Mr. Wilkins said your job at the shop is still available. He's been saving a quarter of your pay since you left as a welcome-back bonus. Said he wasn't going to let the best mechanic in the state slip away, but don't tell him I told you. Jon was grateful. Wilkins was a generous man, although he rarely expressed it openly. He was fair and honest with his customers, but maintained a gruff demeanor that could be off-putting. Sounds good, Dad, Jon said, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. Damn that woman, he thought. His parents hugged him reassuringly. It'll be all right, son, his mother said. We'll get through this together. Several hours later, the attorney returned with a notary. After signing the power of attorney documents, Jon's parents departed, promising to call with updates. They expressed their gratitude to the nurse, who reassured them Jon was in good hands and that physical therapy would be arranged through the VA. Jon was finally alone to confront the wreckage of his life. He tried to rest, but was plagued by dreams of his fallen comrades, not Sandra. A few days later, Jon's father called with an update. Bad news, son, Bob began. Sandra has cleaned out almost all of your checking and savings accounts. About 2 months ago, she withdrew $8,545 from your savings. I have the bank statement. She took the money out in cash. The only deposits during those 2 months were from your military pay. According to the bank and the teller, Sandra came in a few days after each payday and withdrew everything except for $5, just enough to keep the account active. She didn't open a new account, so I have no idea what she did with the money. All right, Dad, Jon sighed. Since you have power of attorney, take her name off the account. We don't have any joint credit cards, so that's not an issue. Will do, Bob replied. I also went by the house. It's a mess. Moldy food on the table, dishes piled up in the sink. It smells terrible. Looks like she took all of her clothes and personal belongings but left her wedding dress and album. I found her wedding and engagement rings in the bathroom trash can. I'm sorry, son. At least the house is still standing, Jon said, trying to maintain a sense of humor. Yeah, Bob replied. Your mother's there now, cleaning and airing out the place. The bed's a disaster, though. The sheets are badly stained. My guess is Sandra had company. What do you want to do about it? Get rid of it, Jon said. Dispose of it and pile it up outside if you have to. I'll sleep on a cot if I need to. All right, Bob said. I'll take care of it. George offered to take your case pro bono. He said there's nothing worse than someone stealing a soldier's wife while he's serving his country. I also found a top-notch lawyer who agreed to handle your divorce for free. He despises Swagman, who apparently has a reputation for chasing after married women. George suggested we change all the locks on your house, and I agreed. Is that okay with you? Yeah, sounds good, Dad, Jon said. All right, we'll keep in touch. How are you holding up? Bob asked, concerned. I'm doing okay, Dad, really, Jon replied. Who are you trying to convince? Me or yourself? Bob asked gently. Jon smiled. His father was perceptive. Dad, you lost men in combat, right? Jon asked. He knew it was a rhetorical question, given his father's service as a second lieutenant with the 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller at the Chosin Reservoir. His father was no stranger to combat, sacrifice, and loss. Yes, son, I have, Bob replied solemnly. This might sound strange, Dad, Jon began hesitantly. But have you ever had dreams where they spoke to you? Oh, yes. At first it was almost every night. It became less frequent over time, Bob said. Have you ever gotten over it? Jon asked quietly. You never completely get over it, son. It becomes a part of you. You have to make peace with it and learn to live with it, or it will consume you, Bob said wisely. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur for Jon. He received daily updates from his parents about Sandra, but never heard directly from her. She had moved in with Eric Swagman and was pregnant with his child. Everyone at the law firm was aware of their affair. The divorce was proceeding smoothly. Jon's lawyer, Mike McGregor, was filing on grounds of adultery and abandonment. He was also suing Eric for alienation of affection and pursuing legal action against Sandra's employer for failing to uphold their ethical standards. Mike mentioned the possibility of additional charges against Swagman based on evidence George had uncovered. Bob told Jon that Sandra had a complete meltdown when she discovered she was no longer on his military pay account and couldn't access his money. She also discovered her house keys no longer worked. Bob and his wife advised her to seek assistance from her boyfriend. Jon focused on his recovery, finding a grim amusement in Sandra's predicament. His physical wounds were healing, but emotionally, he was struggling, grieving for his fallen Marines and reeling from his wife's betrayal. Jon was now able to move around with a crutch and cane, and the doctors decided it was time to remove his cast. He was also cleared to drive a car with an automatic transmission. Back in his room, Jon saw an orderly hanging his freshly cleaned uniform, now adorned with sergeant stripes. A doctor explained that he had been promoted and was being discharged, with physical therapy arranged at a VA facility near his home. Jon donned his crisp green uniform, grabbed his polished boots, and, using a wheelchair and cane, made his way to the day room. There, he was surprised to see his parents, doctors, nurses, orderlies, and Lieutenant Colonel Arvin Johnson, his reserve battalion commander. Jon stood up with the assistance of his cane, surprising everyone, and shook the lieutenant colonel's hand. The colonel announced Jon's promotion to sergeant, expressing pride in Jon's loyalty and abilities, then quipped, "And may God have mercy on your soul," eliciting laughter from everyone present. Jon's parents proudly pinned the new stripes onto his uniform. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson then read a citation awarding Jon the Silver Star Medal for his bravery in Vietnam on January 30th, 1968. As a fire team leader near Da Nang, Jon had led his team against overwhelming enemy forces, continuing to fight despite being wounded. His leadership and courage significantly contributed to the defense of Da Nang, upholding the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the Navy. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson pinned the medal on Jon's chest, thanked him for his service, and noted that his experience would be invaluable for training new recruits. John's mother hugged him tearfully, while Bob, wiping away a tear, expressed his pride. After packing his sea bag, John changed into his Class C uniform, a short-sleeved khaki shirt and green trousers. He took a wheelchair ride to the lobby, where his parents waited for a taxi to the airport. At the airport, he received another wheelchair escort and offered a defiant middle finger to some long-haired protesters who called him a baby killer. A few hours later, his parents wheeled him into his house. It no longer felt like home after Sandra's betrayal, but he appreciated the privacy. His parents had stocked the refrigerator with beer and snacks, and his mother had prepared his favorite meals, including her famous lasagna. He changed into jeans and a t-shirt and put his gear away. At the bottom of his sea bag, he found a large Bowie-style knife he had acquired in Vietnam. The blade was rusty but clean and ornate, with a leather scabbard embossed with a winged creature holding a sword and the words, "Morrow Crave." He treasured it and vowed to research its origins. He called his lawyer, Mike McGregor, and George to schedule a meeting for that afternoon. After a short rest, he checked on his pickup truck in the garage. It seemed to be in working order, although he planned to perform an oil change and tune-up soon. After inspecting his property, he grabbed a beer and sank into his recliner. His leg ached, so he relaxed and turned on the TV, settling on a game show for background noise. He called Wilkins to let him know he was finally back. "It's about damn time you got back," Wilkins grumbled. "When do you think you can start working?" John explained the situation with Sandra and what the doctor had said about physical therapy. "No problem, son. Take the time you need to handle your affairs," Wilkins replied. "If you need to go to court or see the doctor, that's fine. I'm just glad you're home. Most of these kids these days don't even know the difference between a brake pad and a carburetor. If you can make it over here sometime this week, I've got a little welcome home present for you." "I'll do that, thanks," John said, ending the call. Finally, Mike and George arrived. John let them in, shook their hands, and offered them beers, which they accepted as they settled into the living room. "Good to see you back, John," George said. "Your dad told me about your medal. Congratulations. You earned it. Anyway, let's get down to business. I have something you need to hear." He pulled out a small, reel-to-reel tape recorder, a tape already loaded. "Let me set this up for you," he said. "I've been keeping tabs on Sandra and Eric since the beginning. I followed them one night to a steakhouse on the edge of town and managed to get a table right across from them. I'm not sure if they saw me, but they didn't notice the microphone I'd hidden in the plants between our booths. There's some background noise from the waitresses and other diners, but you can clearly hear their conversation." He started the tape and increased the volume. "So, Sandra, have you thought about my proposal?" a male voice, clearly Eric's, asked. John could practically visualize the smug grin on Eric's face. "I'm not sure I can do that to John, Eric. It's bad enough that I cheated on him, and now I'm carrying your baby. But I don't think I can go through with this," Sandra replied. "Come on, babe. If anyone can pull it off, it's you. He's probably drowning his sorrows right now. I bet he'd do anything to have you back," Eric said. "You don't know John very well, Eric. His sense of ethics wouldn't allow him to accept this. There's no way he'll agree to raise this baby as his own, and he definitely won't share me with you," Sandra said. "No, he wouldn't share you. We won't let him. Look, you know I'm not cut out to be a father. John would be a much better parent than me. Here's the plan. We get him to agree to our terms, or we threaten him with divorce. We'll demand his house, half his income, alimony and child support. Don't worry, I've already drafted the paperwork," Eric said. George stopped the tape. "So they actually believe I'm going to let her stay with him and let him raise her illegitimate child? Are they delusional?" John asked incredulously. "There's more," George said, restarting the tape. "I don't know, Eric. John won't agree to that," Sandra said, her voice hesitant. "Come on, babe. You know he's so in love with you, he'd do anything," Eric said. "You're not still in love with him, are you?" "Well, I still like him," she admitted. "But I don't love him like I used to. Besides, you're much better in bed." John's face flushed with anger. "This is what I get for loving that cheating woman," he thought. "And I wouldn't leave you to go to Vietnam. What kind of fool does that make me?" "You're right," she said. "When he gets back, I'll talk to him." "Okay, do that," Eric said. "Do you know when he's coming back?" "No. I haven't heard from him since January, and I haven't sent him anything since last year, like you told me, she said. If he really wants to fight this, we have other options, Eric said, his voice taking on a sinister tone. Like what? Sandra asked. Well, you know how sometimes houses can just catch fire out of nowhere? Or how brakes can suddenly fail? Eric suggested. You're not going to hurt him, are you? Sandra asked, alarmed. I won't be a part of that. Don't worry, Eric reassured her. I know people who can help with that. You'd be completely in the clear. If something were to happen to him, you'd get everything, and you'd be free of him. Well, I guess, Sandra said hesitantly. But only as a last resort, right? Only if we have no other choice? Let's see what happens when he gets back, Eric said. George stopped the tape. That sounds like a plan to commit murder to me, John said, his voice grim. Both George and Mike agreed. It's also a conspiracy to commit fraud and possibly theft, considering Sandra emptied your bank accounts, Mike added. That's why I filed the court papers on the way over and requested an expedited hearing. I also obtained a restraining order that keeps them at least 100 feet away from you, your house, and your parents. I know the court clerk who schedules these things, so I'll be serving them with the papers tomorrow morning. I spoke with the district attorney, and he's preparing a criminal case against them. I also spoke with Lee Marcus, the senior partner at their firm. We've been friends for a long time, and he's furious about what they've been doing. I told him we intend to sue the firm and cite the conspiracy to engage in criminal activity. By the time we're finished, Swagman will be lucky to avoid jail time. Your father and I still have connections in the police department, including the chief, George added. I spoke with a few of them, and they've agreed to keep an eye on you. Any questions so far? George asked. Yeah, John said. What exactly am I asking for in the divorce? Mike handed him a folder containing the legal documents. Sorry, I forgot your dad was acting on your behalf, Mike said. Here's the paperwork. As I mentioned, we're filing for divorce on grounds of adultery and abandonment. Since Sandra has a higher income, there won't be any alimony. You'll keep the house and everything in it, since she abandoned it and didn't pay any of the utilities. We're also demanding she return $7,100, which is half of what was in your joint accounts. Remember, she emptied both your checking and savings accounts and took all of the money you had deposited. We're also asking that she return her rings and revert to her maiden name. She'll keep her clothes and her car. I've asked Lee to keep her employed, since she'll need some income during her pregnancy. From what we understand, Swagman is worth just under $1 million, so we're suing him for $800,000. Between that, his court costs, and attorney fees for both the civil and criminal cases, he'll be nearly bankrupt. We're also asking the firm to pay $2 million for not enforcing their morals clause. The firm will probably settle for about half that amount to avoid bad publicity, Mike added. One last thing, John. Do you have a set of dress blues? Yeah, John replied. Mike nodded. Great. Get them cleaned and pressed, and have all your medals and ribbons mounted. Wear them to court when the trial begins. I want everyone to see what kind of man Sandra and Eric have wronged. I have one more surprise for them, but I'll keep that to myself for now. That's fine with me, John said. I'll get the uniform ready. Just let me know when I need to be there. I will. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meatloaf and an apple pie waiting for me at home. John, take some time to relax, Mike said. I will, John said. I was thinking about heading to the watering hole for a beer and catching up with some old friends. Just be careful, John, George cautioned. That neighborhood has gotten a bit rough since you were last there. Not rougher than Da Nang, I bet, John quipped. George and Mike chuckled. Not quite, George conceded, but almost. After George and Mike departed, John went to his bedroom, changed his shirt, and retrieved the ornate knife he had brought back from Vietnam, hoping to find a friend who was knowledgeable about such things. He locked the house, hobbled to the garage, and started his truck. Man, that feels good, he thought as the engine roared to life. He drove towards one of his old haunts, stopping for gas along the way. He parked in front of the bar, his usual spot, and surveyed the surroundings. George was right. The place looked a bit rougher than it had a year ago. But I've seen much worse, he thought. He entered the bar and made his way through the haze of cigarette smoke. He grabbed a beer and scanned the room, hoping to see a familiar face, but no one he recognized. This used to be a place where regular guys like him would gather and chat over drinks, but now it seemed to attract a different crowd, mostly gang members. He finished his beer and headed back to his truck when he heard a woman's cry for help coming from a nearby alley. He saw a young woman surrounded by 5 or 6. "There's more," George said, restarting the recording. "I don't know, Eric. John's not going to fall for that," Sandra said, her doubt evident. "Come on, babe. You know he's head over heels for you. He'd do anything," Eric insisted. "You're not still in love with him, are you?" "Well, I still like him," she admitted. "But I don't love him like I used to. Besides, you're much better in bed." John's face burned with anger. "This is what I get for loving that cheating witch," he thought. "And I wouldn't leave you to go to Vietnam. What kind of fool am I?" "And you're right," she continued. "When he gets back, I'll talk to him." "Okay, do that," Eric said. "Do you know when he's coming home?" "No. I haven't heard from him since January, and I haven't contacted him since last year, like you said." "If he gives us a hard time, we have other options," Eric said, a menacing tone creeping into his voice. "Like what?" Sandra asked. "Well, you know how houses can sometimes catch fire? Or how brakes can suddenly fail," Eric suggested. "You're not going to hurt him, are you?" Sandra asked, her voice laced with fear. "I won't have any part of that." "Don't worry," Eric said smoothly. "I know people who can help with that. You'd be completely in the clear. If something unfortunate were to happen to him, you'd inherit everything. And you'd be free." "Well, I suppose," Sandra said hesitantly. "But only as a last resort, right? Only if we have no other option." "Let's see what happens when he returns," Eric said. George stopped the recording. "That sounds like a conspiracy to commit murder to me," John said, his voice cold. Both George and Mike concurred. "It's also conspiracy to commit fraud, and possibly theft, given that Sandra drained your bank accounts," Mike added. "That's why I filed the court papers on my way over here and requested an expedited hearing. I also obtained a restraining order, keeping them at least 100 feet away from you, your house, and your parents. I know the court clerk, so I'll be serving them personally tomorrow morning. I've spoken to the district attorney, and he's building a criminal case against them. I also spoke with Lee Marcus, the senior partner at their firm. We're old friends, and he's livid about their behavior. I informed him we intend to sue the firm for its complicity in their criminal activities. By the time we're finished, Swagman will be lucky to avoid prison. Your dad and I still have connections in the police department, including the chief," George added. "I've spoken to a few officers, and they'll be keeping an eye on you." "Any questions so far?" George asked. "Yeah," John said. "What am I asking for in the divorce exactly?" Mike handed him a folder containing the legal documents. "Sorry, I forgot your dad was handling things on your behalf. Here's the paperwork. As I mentioned, we're filing for divorce based on adultery and abandonment. Since Sandra earns a higher salary, there won't be any alimony. You'll keep the house and all its contents because she abandoned it and failed to pay the utilities. We're also demanding she return $7,100, which represents half of the funds from your joint accounts. She emptied both your checking and savings accounts, taking every penny you had deposited. We're demanding she return her wedding and engagement rings and revert to her maiden name. She'll retain her personal belongings and her car. I've asked Lee to keep her employed for the time being, since she'll need some income during her pregnancy. We understand Swagman is worth just under $1 million, so we're suing him for $800,000. With that, plus court costs and legal fees for both the civil and criminal proceedings, he'll be practically bankrupt. We're also suing the firm for $2 million for failing to enforce their morals clause. They'll probably settle for about half that amount to avoid negative publicity, Mike said. One last thing, John. Do you have a set of dress blues? Yes, John replied. Excellent. Get them cleaned and have your medals and ribbons mounted. Wear them to court when the trial begins. I want everyone to see the caliber of man Sandra and Eric have wronged. I have one more surprise up my sleeve, but I'll keep that to myself for now. Fine by me, John said. I'll get the uniform ready. Just let me know when I need to be in court. I will. Now, I have a meatloaf and apple pie calling my name. John, you should relax, Mike said. I will, John replied. I was thinking about stopping by the watering hole for a beer and catching up with some old friends. Just be careful, John, George warned. That area's become a bit rough since you've been gone. Not any rougher than Da Nang, I imagine, John quipped. George and Mike laughed. Not quite, George conceded, but close. After they left, John went to his bedroom, changed shirts, and picked up the ornate knife, hoping to find a friend who was knowledgeable about such weapons. He locked the house, hobbled to the garage, and started his truck. Man, that feels good, he thought, as the engine rumbled to life. He drove toward one of his favorite old hangouts, stopping for gas on the way. He parked his truck in front of the bar, his usual spot, and surveyed the area. George was right. The place looked rougher than it had a year ago. I've seen worse, he thought. He went inside and made his way to the bar through the smoky haze. He ordered a beer and scanned the room, hoping to spot a familiar face, but no one he recognized. This used to be a place for working-class guys like him to unwind and socialize, but now it seemed to be a haven for gang members. He finished his beer and was heading back to his truck when he heard a woman's screams coming from a nearby alley. He saw a young woman surrounded by 5 or 6 men, one of whom was ripping her dress. Grabbing the knife from his truck, John quietly approached the alley. "Hey, leave that woman alone," he yelled. The men paused, startled. One, brandishing a switchblade, moved towards John. John drew his own knife. "Want to play with knives, tough guy?" he asked. The thug lunged, but John sidestepped the attack, slashed the man's wrist, and kneed him in the groin. The rest of the group started to retreat, but 2 remained to confront John. He took one down with a punch to the throat and slashed the other across the chest. Suddenly, a man with a piece of wood appeared from behind and struck John in the face. The attacker fled just as police sirens wailed in the distance. An officer approached John. "Man, Harkness, didn't George warn you this area is dangerous?" "Yeah," John replied. "Guess I'm just too stubborn to listen." The officer surveyed the scene and instructed his partner to call for ambulances. He then retrieved 2 sets of handcuffs, walked over to the men writhing on the ground, and secured their hands behind their backs. Returning to John, the officer noticed the knife lying next to him. "Now that's a knife," he commented. "Where'd you get that?" "Picked it up in Vietnam," John answered. "Let me see it," the officer said. "You have a safe place to keep this?" John asked, handing over the leather scabbard. The officer examined it closely. "French Foreign Legion, really?" he asked. "Marine Corps," John corrected. "Just got back." "I know you were in the Marines, son. I'm talking about the markings on this scabbard. The emblem indicates it's from the French Foreign Legion. The inscription translates to march or die. This doesn't look like standard issue gear. I bet this belonged to a French soldier at some point." The officer returned the knife and scabbard to John. "You should put that somewhere safe before some overzealous cop confiscates it. Maybe frame it," he advised. John nodded. "Yeah, I'll do that." The woman approached the officer. "Please don't arrest him, officer. He saved my life. Those men were going to do terrible things to me." The officer looked at her torn dress. "It's all right, ma'am. He can go. But he needs medical attention, and will need a statement from you. I'll drive him to the emergency room, officer, and I'll give you my statement at the hospital." "Is that all right?" she asked. The officer considered for a moment, then agreed. "All right, miss. You can follow me to the hospital." He called out to his partner, who quickly joined them. The second officer looked at the 3 handcuffed men and whistled. "Wow. Isn't that Juan Mendoza, the gang leader we've been looking for?" He was referring to the smaller man who had attacked John first. The first officer nodded. "Yes, it is. And this guy took down all 3 of them?" the second officer asked incredulously. The first officer nodded again. "Looks like it," he said. "Unbelievable." By then, 2 ambulances had arrived, and paramedics were loading the gang members onto gurneys. The first officer helped John stand. "So, you didn't get enough of this in Vietnam?" he asked with a smile. John chuckled, though it was painful. "Guess not," he replied. "All I wanted was a beer with some friends." "Well, this lady will take you to the ER. Hand me your keys. My partner will drive your truck home, and I'll pick him up after I'm finished at the hospital." He pointed at John. "And stay away from this place. It's gone downhill. Drugs, gangs, you name it. All the decent folks are hanging out at the Rockwood on the other side of town these days." "Thanks, officer. I'll keep that in mind," John said. He followed the young woman, who introduced herself as Amelia Simmons, to her car, a small Dodge Dart. "Aren't you the guy who received the Silver Star in Vietnam?" she asked as they drove to the hospital. "Yes," he replied. "How did you know?" "Who doesn't? It was all over the news today," she said. Why are you out here? Shouldn't you be home with your wife or something? Jon couldn't contain his emotions any longer and began to weep quietly. It was even more painful knowing that strangers seemed to care more about him than his supposedly loving wife. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to upset you. What happened? Jon briefly explained the demise of his marriage, and Amelia's eyes filled with tears. She parked at the emergency room, found a space, and hugged him tightly, not caring about the blood staining her dress. Jon felt embarrassed by her gesture. You poor man, she murmured, tears streaming down her face. That awful woman doesn't deserve you. Jon looked at her, puzzled. Why are you crying? He asked. Those men were going to hurt me. But you intervened, even though you could have been killed. You didn't even know me, but you risked your life for me, she sobbed. I can never repay you for that. Jon hugged her back. You don't owe me anything, he said. Yes, I do, she insisted. I owe you everything. You put aside your own pain to help me, so I'm going to help you heal. No matter how long it takes, I'll mend your broken heart. I swear no one will ever hurt you again. Not like her. You don't even know me, he said, still surprised by her intensity. I didn't know you either, she replied. But after tonight, I know all I need to know. Jon Harkness, you're my hero, my knight in shining armor. I want to care for you, hold you, and fill the emptiness in your heart. Please, let me. Jon considered her words. When he looked into her eyes, he saw only genuine affection, no deception. There was something captivating about her that he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was the stark contrast to Sandra's betrayal. In his mind, he heard Harker's voice. Go for it, Corporal. Sorry, Sergeant. He smiled. Knowing Amelia had no idea why he was laughing, Jon simply said, All right, and gave her a gentle kiss. Amelia hugged him tightly. You won't regret this, Jon. I promise, she said. They entered the emergency room, where the officer was waiting. While a doctor examined both Jon and Amelia, the officer took their statements. The doctor cleaned the cut on Jon's cheek and ordered x-rays. After reviewing the x-rays, the doctor informed Jon that nothing was broken and that the nail in the board had only scratched his skin. Amelia was also unharmed. Jon recounted the events of the evening, and the officer seemed satisfied with his account. Jon, the officer began, Amelia seems like a good person, but she's had a rough time. Her parents died in a car accident a few years ago, and she's been struggling ever since. She has no family, and barely makes ends meet as a waitress. I know you have your own problems and don't need any more, but it would be a kindness if you could look out for her. Maybe you two could support each other. Thanks, Jon said, considering the officer's words. Maybe you're right. He was surprised by what the officer had shared. Amelia hadn't mentioned any of her difficulties, yet she had been the one comforting him. He felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Maybe it was love. Whatever it was, it felt significantly more genuine than anything Sandra had offered. The officer handed Jon a card. Call me if you need anything, he said before turning to Amelia. You can follow me to Jon's place. I need to pick up my partner anyway. She thanked him, and they left the emergency room. They drove to Jon's house in silence. Jon's mind raced. His soon-to-be ex-wife had betrayed him. His Marine buddies were gone, and now there was Amelia. Jon didn't believe in coincidences, but he couldn't help but wonder. They were both hurting, yet they had chosen to put aside their own pain to support each other. When they arrived at Jon's house, he invited her inside after the officers left. Come on in, Amelia. I don't bite, and it's much more comfortable inside than in your car, he said. I don't want to impose, she replied. Jon grabbed one of her bags from the car. Don't worry about it. It's no trouble. I have a spare bedroom, and it's definitely safer than sleeping in your car. Okay, she agreed. I suppose you're right. After settling Amelia's belongings in the guest room, Jon invited her into the living room and offered her a cup of coffee. She accepted and made herself comfortable on the couch while he prepared their drinks. They shared their stories. Jon explained everything about his marriage and his time in Vietnam. Amelia reciprocated, recounting her own life experiences. She told Jon that her parents had worked tirelessly, but always struggled financially. They lived in a small apartment. When they died in a car accident, she was left with nothing. forced to sell their meager possessions. There was no inheritance, and the little money she had went towards covering their funeral expenses. She lost her secretarial job when her boss relocated and ended up waiting tables at a small diner near the alley where she was attacked. The pay was low, but she managed to share an apartment with a friend. Her friend, however, found a job in another state and moved away. Amelia couldn't afford the rent on her own, so she moved in with a man she had dated a few times. Unfortunately, he wanted a more serious relationship than she was ready for and became abusive. After a few weeks, she left and ended up living in her car again, trying to save enough money for a room somewhere. "Why don't you stay here?" Jon suggested. "I don't want to take advantage of your kindness," she replied. "I can't pay you anything, and it wouldn't look good given your divorce situation." "It's okay," Jon said. "You can use the spare bedroom and maybe help me with some chores. If anyone asks about my divorce, I'll simply say you were homeless and I offered you a place to stay in exchange for help around the house." "That sounds fair," Amelia agreed. "I hope you don't get tired of looking at me," Jon said, attempting humor. He laughed. "No worries. I just hope you can handle looking at my face," he said, pointing to his cheek. She gently touched the scar on his cheek and his left ear. "I can manage," she said softly. "Actually, I think it makes you look distinguished, like someone who doesn't tolerate any nonsense." He laughed again. "Flattery will get you far," he said. "Anyway, things might get a little hectic around here for a day or two. Sandra and her boyfriend will be served with legal papers tomorrow morning, so I anticipate a lot of phone calls after 9 a.m. I also have some errands to run. Want to come with me?" "Sure," she replied. "Sounds like fun. I'm off for the next couple of days anyway." "Well, I'm exhausted and my leg is starting to ache, so I'm heading to bed," Jon said. "I'll come with you if that's okay," she said, following him down the hall. "Would it be all right if I slept with you tonight? No intimacy, I just need someone to hold me." "Sure," he said. "I promise I'll be good." She smiled and went to the bathroom to shower and change while Jon got ready for bed. By the time she returned, wearing only a long t-shirt, Jon was already under the covers. She climbed in beside him, and he instinctively put his arm around her. She rested her head on his shoulder, her arm draped across his chest. He thought about how comforting it felt. They drifted off to sleep. They woke up the next morning with Jon spooning Amelia. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Amelia smiled. "Don't apologize," she said. "I put your hand there last night because it felt good. And this felt good too," she added, gently brushing her hand against his groin. "I'm glad you like it," he said, returning her smile. Jon and Amelia showered and dressed for the day. Amelia prepared breakfast while Jon got ready. At 9:20 a.m., the phone rang. "What's all this about a divorce, Jon?" Sandra shrieked. "I don't want a divorce. And what's this nonsense about adultery and abandonment?" "I don't care what you want right now, Sandra," Jon said, his voice cold. "You abandoned the house, refused to pay the bills, stole thousands of dollars from our accounts, slept with Eric Swagman, moved in with him, and now you're pregnant, either by him or someone else. Is that clear enough for you?" "I didn't know you were back, Jon, or I would have visited you," she said, her voice softening. "That's a load of crap," Jon snapped. "It was all over the news. Even complete strangers have welcomed me home. But you're too busy with your boyfriend to care about your husband." "You don't understand, Jon. I still love you," she sobbed. "No, you don't," Jon said angrily. "I haven't heard from you since last year. I learned about everything from my parents when they visited me in the hospital after I was injured. You didn't even send a card. How can you claim to love me while you're sleeping with that loser?" "But I do love you, Jon," she insisted. "No, you don't," Jon repeated. "What did you tell that creep when you talked about me raising your child?" "Oh, right. I don't love him anymore." "Well, that's just fine with me, because right now, I hate you so much, I wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire." "How do you know what I said?" she asked between sobs. He had never spoken to her like this before. "And you don't really mean that, do you? Just sign the divorce papers and let's be done with this." "We're over," Jon said firmly. "And I'm going to take down your boyfriend, too." Suddenly, Eric's voice boomed through the phone. "Listen up, you jerk! I'm going to destroy you." "I don't think so, idiot. Tougher guys than you have tried, and they're dead now. You want to mess with me? I'll beat you so badly, you'll be begging for mercy. You'll feel like you've been hit by a freight train. Check those papers. There's a restraining order against both you and Sandra. I know you two are planning to burn down my house and sabotage my truck. If you come anywhere near me, you'll get a bullet up your ass. By the time I'm finished with you, you'll be lucky if you don't end up in jail, Jon roared. We'll see about that, Eric retorted. Sandra came back on the line. Jon, please, let's talk this over. We don't need a divorce. Eric and I have a proposal we'd like to discuss with you. If you want to talk to my lawyer, Jon said, his voice dripping with contempt. Here's a suggestion for both of you. Go away and stay out of my life. He slammed down the phone and punched the wall. Damn her, he yelled. Amelia rushed over and hugged him. It's okay, Jon. She deserved that, and so did he. Let your lawyer handle it. That's what you're paying him for. Just calm down, okay? How can she still claim to love me after everything she's done? Jon wondered aloud. I don't know, Jon, she replied. She's clearly not thinking rationally. You mentioned you had errands to run. Let's take care of those and get out of here for a while, okay? All right, you're right, he said, his anger subsiding slightly. What's on the agenda for today, she asked. I need to see my boss, drop off my dress blues for cleaning and have the metals mounted, then pick up some parts and tune up my truck. Let's get started then, she said. We've got a lot to do. First, I need to call my lawyer, he said. Amelia nodded, and Jon made the call. He updated Mike about his conversation with Sandra and Eric. Yeah, I thought she was going to faint, Mike said, chuckling. And Swagman looked like he was about to explode. I'm curious to see what kind of proposal they come up with. By the way, I spoke with Lee. He's meeting with the senior partners and the board this afternoon. And make sure your dress blues are ready. We go to court next Friday. Got it. Thanks, Mike, Jon said. I'm dropping them off today. I'll call if I hear anything else. They left the house and took Jon's uniform and medals to the dry cleaner, an old Army veteran who knew his trade. Then they went to see Wilkins. Hey, boss, Jon said as he and Amelia entered the auto shop. Wilkins looked up from his desk, which was buried under paperwork. Hey there. Damn, I need a secretary. I can't keep up with all this paperwork. I've got cars to fix. Jon glanced at Amelia. Seriously? You really want to hire a secretary? He asked. Absolutely, Wilkins exclaimed. Look at this mess. Plus, I have to answer the phones and deal with customers at the counter. I know someone who used to be a secretary and might be looking for a better job. Interested? Jon suggested. Hell yes, Wilkins replied enthusiastically. Jon gently took Amelia's arm. Boss, let me introduce you to my friend, Amelia Simmons. She's a former secretary. Wilkins looked at Amelia. Think you can handle all this, young lady? He asked. Amelia nodded confidently. Absolutely. I can type 50 words per minute, file, take shorthand, and handle customers. I can even work the cash register. Wilkins considered for a moment, then asked, Are you currently employed? Yes, I'm a waitress, but I don't earn much, she replied. Here's what I'll do, Wilkins proposed. Give your current employer 2 weeks' notice, and then come work for me. Since you're Jon's friend, I'll start you at $125 a week. How does that sound? Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Wilkins, she said, beaming. Do you know anything about cars? He asked. Not as much as you, but my dad taught me quite a bit, she answered. That's even better, Wilkins exclaimed. Oh, Jon, I have something for you. He handed Jon an envelope. Consider it a welcome home bonus. Jon opened the envelope and found a check for $2,240. He shook Wilkins's hand gratefully. Thanks, boss. This really means a lot. You've earned it, Wilkins replied. Now go take care of that cheating wife, and then get back to work. Will do, boss, Jon said. Wilkins waved them off. All right, you two, get out of here. Get going, Wilkins said, waving them off. They shook hands with the old man and left. Wow, $125 a week, Amelia exclaimed. I've never earned that much. Thanks again, Jon. Don't mention it, Jon said. That's almost double what I make as a sergeant in the Corps. No way, Amelia said, incredulous. Yep, Jon confirmed. You really know about cars? Jon asked, curious. Yeah, Amelia replied. We didn't have much money growing up, so Dad taught me how to fix things. I learned to tune up a car, change belts and tires, and even do oil changes. Don't let Wilkins hear that, or he'll have you working on cars all the time, Jon joked. Amelia laughed. I don't mind getting a bit of grease on my hands. Just get whatever you need for the truck, and I'll show you what to do, she said. Jon smiled. Wow, I think I'm falling for you, Jon confessed. Amelia giggled and kissed him on the cheek. Me too, she admitted. They stopped at Jon's bank, where he deposited the check, transferring 10% to his savings account, as was his habit. He withdrew $100 for spending money and ordered new checks without Sandra's name. Then they went to an auto parts store and purchased everything Jon needed for his truck. After grabbing a quick burger, they headed home. Jon thought about how the house felt like a home again, with Amelia there. He pulled the truck into the garage and gathered his tools and the new parts while Amelia went inside to change. She returned wearing old, worn jeans and a t-shirt. "So what should we do?" Jon asked. Amelia picked up the spark plugs and wires. "I'll handle the plugs and wires, and you can do the oil change," she said. "Sounds good," Jon replied. "Do you know how to set the gap on the plugs?" "Are you serious?" she asked, a playful smirk on her face. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed the necessary tools and got to work. Jon watched in amazement as she expertly handled his tools. He collected what he needed and started changing the oil. By the time he was finished, she had replaced the spark plugs, wires, rotor, and distributor cap. He inspected her work and was impressed. Everything looked perfect, but appearances could be deceiving, so he lowered the truck and started the engine. He turned the key, and the truck roared to life, just as he'd hoped. He revved the engine slightly and listened carefully for any unusual sounds, pleased with the smooth, powerful rumble. He turned off the truck and looked at Amelia, who now had grease smudged across her face and hands. At that moment, she looked more beautiful to him than Sandra ever had. "So?" she asked, anticipating his verdict. Jon cupped her greasy face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "I'm definitely falling in love with you," he murmured. "You're hired," she quipped, unconcerned about the grease on her face. He handed her his hand cleaner. He remembered wishing Sandra would enjoy these moments with him, but she always complained about his work being too messy. After they cleaned up, Amelia cooked dinner, and they enjoyed a quiet evening watching television. Jon felt more at peace than he had in a long time, and managed to sleep through the night without thinking about his soon-to-be ex-wife. The following days were a blur of activity. Jon retrieved his dress blues from the cleaners and spent hours meticulously removing any stray threads and polishing his brass and shoes. Amelia gave her 2 weeks' notice at the diner. To her annoyance, she was told her employment was terminated immediately and that she could return in a few days to collect her final paycheck. During those days, Jon and Amelia grew closer, deciding to postpone a physical relationship until after Jon's divorce was finalized. Jon found this challenging. It had been a long time since he had been intimate with a woman. But he was genuinely developing strong feelings for Amelia, and she seemed to reciprocate. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. Jon showered, shaved, and dressed in his uniform. After breakfast, he went into the living room, where Amelia was waiting, looking lovely in a printed dress. "Wow," she said, admiring him in his dress uniform adorned with his medals. "You look fantastic." Jon smiled. "Thanks, but I feel like a Christmas tree." "You look amazing too," he added sincerely. At the courthouse, they were greeted by 14 Marines from Jon's unit, including Lieutenant Colonel Johnson and Sergeant Major Roberts. After brief introductions, they entered the courtroom. The Marines filled 2 rows as Jon approached the table where Mike was waiting. Jon's parents also joined the group. Jon glanced at Sandra and Eric, seated at the opposite table. Sandra's eyes widened when she saw the man she had betrayed. Though he looked impressive in his uniform, she was startled by his missing ear and facial scars. Eric smirked and rubbed Sandra's pregnant belly. Sandra hadn't yet noticed Amelia. The judge entered the courtroom, and the bailiff instructed everyone to stand. Once everyone was seated, the judge addressed the Marines. "What brings you here today, gentlemen?" he inquired. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson stood up. "Your Honor, my Marines and I are here to show our support for Sergeant Harkness and, if necessary, to testify to his character." The judge nodded. "Thank you, Colonel. I don't anticipate needing that, but I appreciate the gesture." The Marines remained silent but glared at Sandra and Swagman throughout the hearing, which proceeded as Mike had outlined. The judge asked both parties a series of questions regarding their marital history and the reasons for Jon's divorce. Proceedings went smoothly and without unnecessary drama. Sandra admitted to abandoning the house, neglecting the utility payments, and becoming pregnant by Swagman, who then had the audacity to petition the judge to order Jon to pay child support. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to order Mr. Harkness to pay child support for a child you fathered? Are you serious, or are you simply not thinking clearly? Throughout the hearing, the judge denied every motion and request from Swagman. In the end, the judge ruled in Jon's favor, granting him everything he had requested: the house, a permanent restraining order against Sandra and Eric, and no child support payments. Sandra was also ordered to return half of the money she had withdrawn from their joint account and revert to her maiden name. She didn't have to return her rings, as she had already discarded them. Swagman protested the ruling, but the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel. "Mr. Swagman," the judge said, using his gavel to point at him, "I'm ordering a full investigation into your involvement in this case. At the very least, there's a significant conflict of interest here, and I understand the district attorney is looking into other potentially illegal activities, including conspiracy. I'm also aware of the lawsuit against you for alienation of affection. Your actions and responses today will be taken into consideration in that matter." He banged his gavel again. "Mr. Harkness's petition for divorce is granted." Swagman jumped up, enraged, and lunged towards Jon, but was restrained by the bailiff. "You bastard," Swagman yelled. "I'm going to kick your ass. I'll keep messing with your ex and anyone else you get involved with. I'll ruin you." "I don't think so," Jon said calmly. Swagman looked at Jon, then at the Marines in the courtroom, who were glaring at him and Sandra with undisguised hostility. Sandra looked down, ashamed. Lee Marcus, who had been observing from the back of the courtroom, approached Swagman. "You're fired," Lee said coldly. "I'm also filing a formal complaint with the state bar. Pack up your things and leave my office by the end of the day." He glanced at Sandra as Swagman stormed out, cursing under his breath. "You still have a job, Sandra, at least until after the baby is born and you've had time to recover. We'll reassess your performance then." He turned to Jon, shook his hand, and said, "Thank you for your service, Sergeant. On behalf of the partnership and the board of directors, I apologize for what you've been through." He then addressed Mike. "Given the circumstances, and in recognition of Mr. Harkness's service, the board accepts your initial offer. We see no need for further hearings. Please schedule an appointment with me next week to finalize the details." Mike nodded and shook Lee's hand. "Thanks, Lee. I'll call you on Monday." Lee smiled. "Great. Maybe now I can win back some of my money on the golf course." He turned and left. Amelia rushed over to Jon and hugged him. Jon returned the embrace and noticed Sandra watching him through her tears. As he ended the hug, Sandra spoke. "Jon, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." "Well, you did," he replied. "I just want to know one thing. Why?" Sandra shrugged. "I don't know. You were gone. Eric was there. Maybe I was thinking about money, tired of being broke. One thing led to another, and, well, you know the rest." "What were you two talking about?" he asked. "Eric thought you'd be okay with raising my child, while I continued my relationship with him," she admitted. "I didn't like the idea at first, but it grew on me. Again, I'm sorry." Jon shook his head. "I see. You didn't waste any time replacing me," Sandra said, glancing at Amelia. Amelia stepped in front of Jon, ready to defend him. "I'm not here to replace you," she said firmly. "I'm here to heal a good man's heart, the heart you broke, and I intend to spend the rest of my life doing that." Sandra looked down ashamed. "I guess I deserve that," she murmured. "Jon, do you think we could ever be friends again?" "I'm not sure, Sandra," he replied honestly. "You hurt me deeply. If it weren't for Amelia and my family, I might not even be here now." "I didn't know, Jon. I'm truly sorry," Sandra said, weeping. She turned and fled the courtroom. Jon shook Mike's hand. The other Marines and Jon's parents gathered around them. "Thanks for everything, Mike. I really owe you one," Jon said. Mike waved him off. "Hey, that's what friends and family are for, right? Plus, I've always wanted to see that jerk Swagman get what he deserved. I'll catch up with you next week, after I meet with Lee. You've got a big payday coming. Now go out and celebrate. You've earned it." After shaking hands with the Marines and gathering his belongings, Mike left. "Good job, Sergeant," Colonel Johnson said, shaking his hand. The other Marines also offered their congratulations and best wishes. After they left, Jon's parents embraced him. "We're so proud of you, son," his mother said. "And who is this lovely lady?" she asked, smiling at Amelia. Jon proudly introduced Amelia, and his parents hugged her warmly, as if she were already part of the family. "You need to bring her over for dinner sometime, son," his mother said. Jon smiled. "I plan to do that a lot from now on." Sandra's pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, and she was told she couldn't have any more children. The firm retained her, but under a strict contract prohibiting personal relationships with colleagues. She worked there for 20 years and remained single, occasionally observing Jon and Amelia's growing family from a distance. Tragically, she was later killed in a car accident. Jon, Amelia, and his parents attended her funeral. Eric Swagman lost most of his money battling the various lawsuits. He lost his case against Jon, and all his appeals to the state bar were denied. The district attorney, declined to press charges against Eric due to insufficient evidence. However, one night after leaving a bar, Eric was severely beaten by masked assailants, sustaining significant injuries to his groin and a cryptic message carved into his chest. Weeks later, he was found hanged. Jon proposed to Amelia the day his divorce was finalized. They married in a beautiful ceremony, complete with the traditional Marine sword arch. They continued working for Wilkins until he passed away in 1980, leaving the auto shop to Jon in his will. Jon remained in the Marine Reserves, retiring as a master gunnery sergeant in 1992, a year after the Gulf War. He still occasionally had nightmares about Vietnam, but he managed them effectively. Jon and Amelia ran the auto shop together until their retirement in 2008, passing the business on to their two sons. 10 years later, while window shopping, Jon saw a framed print of the rose tattoo he had almost gotten in Vietnam. It sparked an idea. He decided to get Amelia's name tattooed over his heart. "What are you doing?" Amelia asked, curious. Jon explained, "I want your name right here, over my heart, where it belongs. You promised to heal my broken heart all those years ago, and you did. Now I want everyone to know how much I love you." Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to do that," she said, touched by his gesture. "Oh, yes, I do," Jon insisted. "I owe you everything." She sat down, knowing that once Jon made up his mind, nothing could change it. "Are you sure you want to do this, Grandpa?" the tattoo artist asked. Jon removed his shirt. "Absolutely," he said firmly. "Okay," the artist replied, preparing his equipment. "Will it hurt?" Amelia asked, concerned. "Yeah," Jon admitted. "It's going to hurt a lot, but it's worth it to me." Amelia smiled and wiped away her tears as she watched the artist carefully tattoo her name onto his skin.